Good morning, class. It's Mr. Parrish coming to you from my kitchen. And normally I wouldn't do this for you, but I figured since tomorrow we have our test, and I said we would go over a couple of days of notes. I wanted to quickly go over um, Tuesday's notes from last week, E, Reformation leaders, and then F, G, and H from Thursday and Friday. So if you could get out your notes and maybe add some stuff to this, you probably want to pause this a few times while you do it. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about first the other Reformation leaders. And there are a few of them here that you have in your notes. And the first one's kind of a big one. And he's a guy named John Calvin. And Calvin is important because he writes this book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And Calvin comes after Luther. And Calvin's kind of interesting because if you know anything about like American history, you know that the Pilgrims and the Puritans, when they came over to America, they were very like devout, like super devout, right? Like they were not very fun because they were so devoted to religion, almost like the Middle Ages. And a lot of their ideas came from this guy, John Calvin. And he noted two things in his book. The first one is that men and women are sinful by nature. So basically, we're all born sinners. All right? And the second is that very few people are actually saved. So basically, according to Calvin, we're all sinners, and only a few of us are going to get to go to heaven. So this made people like ultra religious at the time. The other stuff that you wrote down there, things like the ideal government is a theocracy. Remember that a theocracy is where the government leaders are the church leaders, and there aren't many of those in the world today. I think like the biggest one in the world would be Iran, and how the government leaders in Iran are also the church leaders. Saudi Arabia is a little bit of a theocracy as well. If we keep moving down here, people that were inspired by Calvin, one of them is John Knox, who John Knox Village is named for. He helped form the Presbyterian Church. He was a Scottish guy. And so he's one. Another is this guy here whose format is off, Henry the Fourth. Now, he's not related at all to Henry the Eighth. Henry the Fourth is a French king. And there was a religious civil war going on in France in the 16th century, and it ended with the election of Henry IV as king. And Henry IV is a Protestant, and the war, as you know, would be between the Protestants and the Catholics. Henry is a Protestant, and he wants to be king, and so he's basically able to compromise his beliefs, and he is able to become king because he says Paris is worth a mass. And that's kind of a double meaning there, a mass being a Catholic service. And what came after Henry IV was this decree, this Edict of Nantes. And that's how you pronounce that word there. Nantes is actually pronounced Nantes. And remember the Edict of Milan, we learned about that in the first unit, and I said the edict was a religious decree. This is another religious decree. And what it allowed is the different leaders of different states in France to choose their own religion. And the verbiage actually goes, whose the region is the religion. So you'd have Catholic regions and you'd have Protestant regions and so forth. The last guy here under the other Reformation leaders is Henry VIII, and this was a guy that was in your chart, so we talked about him a little bit. We talked about the Act of Supremacy in 1534. Something we didn't talk about in your chart was this. The Pope names Henry VIII Defender of the Faith, because after Luther is forcing a lot of people to, no, he's not forcing, but he's convincing a lot of people to leave the church is kind of leery of losing support. And so in order to keep England from basically going the way of Luther, he gives Henry VIII this title, basically making him the second highest political leader in Europe, right under the Holy Roman Emperor. And so he names him Defender of the Faith, which is a big honor for the English king there. The other set of notes here are, I believe, from, Thursday. And these are F, G, and H. Okay, so the first thing says common Protestant ideas. So these are things that all Protestants believe, these three things. Okay, one is no Protestant is basically beneath the Pope. There is no Pope in the Protestant religions. The second, the thing that's really important to Luther, is that people can interpret the Bible themselves. And the last thing is salvation comes from faith alone, basically meaning that like there aren't like rituals like in the Catholic Church. So you don't have confirmation, you don't have last rites, you don't have confession. You have some of the other things like baptism and matrimony and all that, but there aren't like hoops to jump through in order to attain salvation. It just comes from faith. All right. The Catholics in the year 1545, a good 30 years after the 95 Thesis, have their own little meeting, and what they decide is they have a meeting here at a place called Trent, and it's called the Council of Trent. And what they decide is that they need to make some like hard and fast rules. Okay, and so here are four things that they come up with. One is no one can interpret the Bible but the church. So there is no like individual interpretation. So like whatever the church decides the Bible means, that's what it means. Second is works of salvation are defined, basically meaning like everyone can be saved as long as they do these basic things. Okay. The third is that church traditions were set, which meant that like all of the masses would come from above. So, and above not meaning like heavenly, but meaning like from the Pope. And this is why, like, if you go to a mass service in one part of the country, it's the exact same service in another part of the country. They all do the exact same thing. It's called a common mass. So that is part of this Bible and church tradition. And then finally they said, we're okay with indulgences, but only if you want to. So they couldn't actually like slam the door on indulgences. Instead, they said, we're willing to take your money, basically, is what they said. All right. They also did a couple of bad things, the church. One is they came up with a list of forbidden books, meaning like you could only, if you were in possession of these like books, and we'll talk about these in the scientific revolution, like what books were forbidden. But if you had those, you were in violation of the church. And the second thing is they wanted to punish heretics and people like Luther, people who we saw in the film Luther. And what they did is they put them on a very unfair trial, a trial called the Inquisition. Okay, these last things are the results of the Reformation. One is there's no more religious unity in Europe. Second is you're going to have a lot of religious wars. Religious wars basically are going to last until World War I, all right, between Catholics and Protestants. So for the next 350 years. The third thing is morality now has like a single standard. So basically people know this is right and this is wrong, all right? And the last thing is it promoted a lot of education. Because of the Reformation, you had more people literate than they were before. Okay? So hopefully that helps out your notes. You can go over some of that stuff. You should have already had this down, so hopefully you have all that. And I'll see you tomorrow for your test. If you have any questions beyond that like sheet, that instruction sheet, feel free to email me, and I will see you tomorrow.